The horror game genre has proven to be widely successful, with these games garnering mass appeal through their ability to scare players. But what makes this genre of games so scary? Is it the emotional response that things like color and shading evoke? Or maybe is it due to hellish creatures? These aspects together comprise what is known as the horror aesthetic. All of these seem to play a key role in making a game scary. So I must ask, could a game truly be scary without these? Or rather, is the graphical horror aesthetic essential to horror games themselves? I'd argue that it is absolutely necessary. We will be exploring this through the use of Resident Evil for Game Boy Color, a game by Capcom that was slated to come out in 1999. But was never actually released. Thankfully, it had a 90% complete beta version leaked onto the internet back in 2012, and through the use of an emulator, that's how we'll be exploring it today. This is not to be confused either with Resident Evil Gaiden, a game that was released for the Game Boy Color in 2001. While that game is a completely original adventure within the Resident Evil universe, the title that we're looking at today aimed to be a complete remake, or rather, demake of the original PlayStation classic for Nintendo's 8-bit color handheld. Now, this video is not meant to downplay the effects of the horror aesthetic of classic horror titles such as Alone in the Dark, but rather to contrast this title with its more advanced counterparts to see if the horror impact that was caused in Resident Evil was possible in an 8-bit form, and to see if the look of horror itself is essential for horror to exist. To aid in answering today's question, we will be using several sources, which will be mentioned as necessary, with the most notable of these being Revival Horror, New Ideas in Fear-Making by Michael Thompson of GamaSutra.com. In the original Resident Evil title, players assumed a role here of either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, members of the paramilitary group STARS. This team is sent to investigate a series of murders that have occurred outside of Raccoon City. The STARS Bravo team is sent in initially, though their helicopter mysteriously crashes. From there, the Alpha team, which Chris and Jill are a part of, is sent in to investigate. Upon arriving at the helicopter crash site, the team is attacked by dogs and forced to take cover in a nearby abandoned mansion. Depending on whether Chris or Jill is chosen, either Chris or a fellow team member named Barry is separated from the group, and the player must go off to investigate. What makes this game impressive and brings us to the question we are trying to answer today is the graphical style. Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1 was a polygonal third-person shooter that made use of a variety of fixed camera angles. The Game Boy Color port attempts to replicate this in as close to a one-to-one fashion as possible. As 3D polygons are essentially impossible on a Game Boy, the look here is achieved by drawing out each area in a way that causes the illusion of depth. As sprite scaling was not possible on the Game Boy hardware, individual sprites for every character in the game have been created for every position in the room. Just running from the front of a room to the back, for example, causes a multitude of character sprites to be cycled through in succession, thus creating the illusion of a single sprite moving through a 3D environment containing depth. In some rooms, if the player or monster is moved to certain sections, they will appear to be nothing more than an indiscernible pixelated mass. Furthermore, due to the limited color palette of the GBC, this game appears to be more vibrant and colorful than its more advanced counterparts. This results in enemies appearing a bit different as well. For example, the zombie, one of the most iconic horror monsters, appears here as merely a pale man in a green suit. This raises another question. Is Resident Evil on Game Boy Color a horror game? Well, first we must define what horror is. Horror, as put by Roam Gohl of the Harvard Crimson in his article Dead Letter, The Aesthetics of Horror, can be defined in two ways. In the first instance, horror is used to indicate a particular emotional response to a stimulus. Borrowing from Latin, the literal meaning is the bristling of hair. In the second instance, horror is the genre of art that is somehow connected with this emotion. We are looking to see if this game contains a graphical aesthetic that is meant to and can achieve some sort of emotional response from the player. As this is horror we are discussing, said response would likely be one of suspense, anxiety, or fear. In short, the goal of the aesthetic here should be to scare us as players. Part of what made Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1 achieve its dark, foreboding atmosphere was its use of lighting. Often areas will be dim, save for a few small specks of light. This is done to constantly keep the player on their toes. This is essential to horror, according to Thompson, because in non-horror games, it's easy to use combat as a defining gameplay mechanic because there is no need to keep mysterious beasts lurking in the shadows. In horror, the moment when a monster becomes familiar is when the tension and dread begins to deflate. By keeping the disfigured looking creatures of this game hidden away, the player must remain constantly cautious, as an unforeseen attack could occur at any moment. However, such lighting is impossible on the Game Boy Color, though everything here is in general much more vividly colorful than the original, and as a result, there is less suspense or terror in each enemy encounter. Granted, many of these enemies are not actually threatening in Resident Evil proper, but rather they appear threatening due to the grim aesthetic surrounding them. The effect is essential in horror games, for, as described by Thompson, if combat against enemies is going to be used, the enemy encounters must be naturally lessened, placing added importance on using art and sound cues to guide a player's emotions before and after a fight sequence. That is not to completely discredit the attempts at mood setting that are given here, for some areas do look fantastic for an 8-bit system, and clearly conveyed what is needed, for the most part anyways. However, the effect of enemy encounters here is still on the whole lessened in comparison to the PlayStation version, because of how the mood setting is done here. Though the enemies do not retain their iconic looks, the GBC Resident Evil contains many of the aspects used by its technologically superior counterparts to set atmosphere. This game still makes use of fixed camera angles, or rather, maps are drawn to create the illusion of fixed camera angles, as there is no real camera in this version. But regardless, players still must anticipate what is around each corner, and must be able to react accordingly to whatever supposedly terrifying creature is lurking. In theory, this means that any time a zombie is suddenly encountered, that in itself could constitute a jump scare, though I use this phrase loosely. While I did not personally find the majority of encounters here scary, perhaps some players would. And there was one encounter that did quite startle me, and that was Plant 42. A massive carnivorous plant that seems Lovecraftian in design. I would argue that this is quite scary here, as at one point when the player comes across its roots, they appear less as plant roots and more like a swath of tentacles. And it was here where I realized that, though much of the game up to this point played on the horror aesthetic, it was only at this point that the game presented something that could fit the definition of horrifying, for me at least. To quote Thompson yet again, horror games has focused on instilling fear in players through confrontation with monsters, zombies, and demons, all storybook abstractions who become absurd when considered in the sober light of day. And yes, the idea of a flower that is borderline tentacle monster is completely absurd when viewed objectively. At that moment, it seems like something that would be horribly dangerous if it existed in the real world. In short, it caused a heightened emotional reaction of sorts for me, the player, a reaction that would not be possible without the horror aesthetic itself. I feel perhaps this is because unlike other game genres, such as a platform or turn-based role-playing game, a horror game cannot be broken down into base components without graphics. For example, a platformer could be broken down to jump from platform to platform, the turn-based RPG to walk around, fight enemies in a turn-based fashion. However, horror cannot stand on its own in such a way, and perhaps would be better described less as a genre, but more a descriptor that can be applied to other genres. For example, if Resident Evil in any form is broken down, it will become walk around in third person, fight or avoid enemies. Nothing is inherently horrifying about that, but rather, the horror effect is achieved once graphics are applied to the game itself. I would argue that this is because horror, by definition, has to rely on an emotional response. Am I saying that the Game Boy Color version of Resident Evil is not a horror game? Not at all. Though it is debatably much less horrifying than the PlayStation 1 original, but that is not the point of this video. The point here is to use this version of this game to explore how essential the horror aesthetic is to creating horror itself, particularly within the realm of horror video games. Ultimately, I conclude it is. Without art that elicits feelings of horror, horror itself is not possible.